Stop calling me over and over. I am in the middle of crucial work. My husband's irritated voice played from the smartphone, echoing through the dead silence of the living room. Behind his angry tone, I could faintly hear the sound of crashing ocean waves. Mixed in with it was the high-pitched laughter of a young woman. I did not yell. I did not scream or cry. I simply stared at the screen, tracing my fingertip over the red list of 30 missed calls. Resting on the fireplace mantel across the room was a pristine white urn. It held the ashes of my husband's mother, my mother-in-law Margaret, whom I had cared for over the past 20 years. Just a few hours ago, the cremation and funeral home arrangements had been finalized, and she had returned to this house with me. My husband, Marcus, still knew nothing. He did not know that while he lied about an important business trip to enjoy a tropical vacation in Hawaii with his mistress, his biological mother had taken her last breath on a cold hospital bed. He also did not know that I had already finished preparations to leave this house forever. A faint scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements lingered in the room. Sitting at the dining table, I quietly placed a thick stack of legal documents in front of me. It was a petition for divorce, already signed and notarized by me. On top of it, I placed the platinum wedding band that I had never taken off for 20 years. The cold metal made a tiny clink as it touched the paper. Strangely, my heart was completely at peace. My tears had entirely dried up 3 nights ago. Everything started 3 nights ago in the hospital emergency room. Margaret, please hold on. I had ridden in the back of the ambulance, holding the hand of my mother-in-law who had suddenly collapsed in the hallway of our home. Amid the blaring sirens, I kept dialing Marcus with trembling fingers. It would ring once, twice, 3 times, echoing in vain before dropping straight to voicemail. Even after arriving at the hospital, I sat in the corner of the waiting room and continued calling. Marcus, please just pick up. I stared at the screen as if in prayer, but there was no answer. Around the 10th call, passing nurses began casting sympathetic glances my way. By the 20th call, my hands grew cold, not from anger, but from sheer terror. Margaret's life was flickering, about to go out. Marcus, her only son, absolutely needed to be by her side. When he left the house claiming he had to entertain crucial corporate clients, I had still tried to believe him. When I hung up the 30th call, the heavy doors of the trauma bay swung open and the attending doctor stepped out. Family of Margaret. With those short words and the doctor's lowered gaze, I understood everything. Connected to countless tubes, Margaret's face looked shockingly pale and small. I collapsed by her bedside and wrapped both of my hands around her rapidly cooling hand. Margaret, I am so sorry. I just cannot reach Marcus. The tears running down my cheeks fell onto the back of her hand. That was when it happened. Her fingers, which shouldn't have had any consciousness left, twitched. She faintly squeezed my hand back. I snapped my head up as if pulled by a string. Beneath the oxygen mask, her lips moved ever so slightly. No sound came out, but after seeing her face every single day for 20 years, I understood perfectly. It is okay now. That was undeniably what she seemed to say. Then, as if mustering the very last ounce of her strength, Margaret pressed something into the palm of my hand. It was a small silver lockbox key that she had always kept hidden on her person. The moment my eyes widened in shock, she quietly closed hers. The heart monitor flatlined, emitting a steady, endless hum. There was no longer any need to make a 31st call. The following 2 days felt like a freezing storm. Contacting relatives, arranging the memorial service, meeting with the funeral director, I handled every single detail entirely alone. At the wake in the memorial, the cold stares of the extended family pierced right through me. What do you mean her only son Marcus is not here? It is because you, his wife, did not try hard enough to contact him. This is exactly why useless wives are nothing but trouble. Countless heartless remarks were hurled at me, and I simply kept my head bowed deeply. I lacked the energy to argue back. Besides, sitting heavily in the pocket of my black morning dress was that key Margaret had entrusted to me at the very end. Only the cold metallic sensation of that key kept me standing. None of the relatives knew. They did not know that I had not just been enduring the abuse these past few days. I had been quietly making preparations to honor Margaret's final wishes, and today all the ceremonies were over. I had returned to the house. The red light of the setting sun stretched long across the empty living room. I had placed a single small suitcase by the front door. Inside was the bare minimum of clothing and a few personal necessities. Despite living in this house for 2 decades, I was amazed by how little I actually wanted to take with me. I dropped my gaze back to the smartphone on the table. The voicemail from Marcus was still displayed on the screen. I am in the middle of crucial work. I was now absolutely certain of the deep betrayal hiding behind those words. A few days before Margaret collapsed, I had accidentally found a receipt in the glove compartment of Marcus's car. It was a payment record for a couple's stay at a luxury beachfront resort in Maui. There was also a purchase history for a high-end designer swimsuit and a diamond necklace. Marcus knew his mother was in declining health. Yet he packed his bags and flew off to an island with his mistress. While his mother suffered and took her final breath, he was likely clinking glasses by the beach. I took a deep breath and looked around the living room. The sofa, the television, the dining table, everything was packed with memories of Marcus, Margaret, and myself. However, I no longer belonged here. Strangely, all my lingering attachments and sorrow had vanished. I picked up the smartphone and powered it down completely. The screen went black, entirely severing my connection to my husband. Left on the table were the divorce papers, the ring, and a brief note. On it, I wrote just one sentence. I saw Margaret off to the very end. Please direct all future correspondence to my attorney. Grabbing the handle of my suitcase, I opened the front door, and the brisk evening wind brushed my cheeks. I locked the door, then dropped the house key deep into the mailbox slot. The small clattering sound signaled the end of my 20-year marriage. I started walking without looking back even once. I was not heading to my childhood home. I was heading to the place where that small silver key fit. A secret location Margaret had left behind to save me. Right now, Marcus was probably embracing his mistress at a resort hotel, believing he had won it all, believing his annoying mother would die soon enough, and his obedient wife was sitting quietly at home. But he had no idea. He did not know that the very thing he feared most was already in my hands. He did not know that tomorrow morning, the moment he received a certain phone call, his entire world would collapse and his true hell would begin. The cold night breeze cooled my flushed cheeks. The wheels of my suitcase rattled dryly against the asphalt. I walked alone down the dark street toward the train station. I had lived in this town for 20 years, yet I felt as if I were walking through an entirely unfamiliar place. In my pocket rested the small silver key. As I walked, I traced its cold edges with my fingertips. Why had I endured that house for so long, even after noticing my husband's betrayal? People around me probably assumed I was dependent on him. Or they pied me, thinking that as a homemaker, I had nowhere else to run. But the reason was completely different. I stayed in that house for nobody else but Margaret. I lost my parents in a car crash when I was very young, and grew up feeling like a burden in the homes of distant relatives. Because of that, I harbored an unusually strong yearning for a real family. When I first married Marcus, Margaret was an incredibly strict woman. The seasoning of the food, the way I cleaned the baseboards, the protocol for sending holiday cards, she critiqued every tiny detail. And I hid in the corner of the kitchen to cry countless times. But behind her strictness, there was always a deep affection for me. Whenever I pushed myself too hard and fell ill with a fever, Margaret would be the first to bring me homemade chicken soup. "Elena, you are family now. You need to learn to lean on me." The warmth of her hand awkwardly rubbing my back that day was something I would never forget for the rest of my life. Before I knew it, Margaret had become a true mother figure to me. 3 years ago, Margaret suffered a severe stroke that left the left side of her body paralyzed. From the day she began living in a wheelchair, Marcus's attitude grew drastically cold. Living with a sick person is suffocating. I cannot relax in my own house. Saying this, he started coming home late almost every single night. Even on weekends, he claimed he had urgent corporate projects, and left the house without so much as looking at his mother's face. The burden of caregiving fell entirely on my shoulders. Preparing finely pured meals, helping her bathe, assisting her to the bathroom in the middle of the night. It was an everyday reality. Yet, I did not consider it a burden in the slightest. Whenever Margaret looked down with an apologetic expression and whispered her apologies, I squeezed her hands tightly. "I want to take care of you. Please do not worry about it, Margaret." When I said that, she would always nod, shedding quiet tears. However, Marcus's cruelty escalated day by day. One night, I smelled the sweet scent of women's perfume on his dress shirt. Showing no remorse, he spat out his cruel plans. "She is too much trouble. Let us just dump the old bat in the cheapest nursing home we can find." I stopped eating and glared at him. "Margaret wants to live in her own home. You spoil her too much. I am the one putting food on this table with my money. You listen to me." His shouting could undoubtedly be heard by Margaret in the adjacent bedroom, separated only by a thin wall. When I went to her room later, she was trembling beneath her blankets. I never left the house because I had to protect her from her own son. Now Margaret was gone and the memorial service had ended just hours ago. The family gathering room had felt more like a raucous bar. Marcus's uncle, Richard, loudly complained while drinking a beer. A funeral without the eldest son is utterly unheard of. Elena, did you really try to contact him? I kept my head bowed deeply. I called him 30 times, but it went straight to voicemail. I am truly sorry. Next. Marcus's Aunt Susan scoffed at me. You probably did something to make Marcus sick of you. You lack the proper sense of duty expected of a wife. The relatives had no idea Marcus was vacationing on a tropical island with a mistress. They decided everything was the fault of an incompetent wife. I hope you have not been hiding Margaret's bank statements and checkbooks while Marcus is away. Susan's sharp remark caused the cold stares of the entire room to lock onto me. I lifted the teapot to pour more tea. My hands shook slightly, spilling a few drops onto the saucer. Still, I absolutely refused to argue back. Shouting or exposing Marcus's absence here would not bring Margaret any peace. I simply replied that I knew nothing about her finances. Then I gently squeezed the key through the fabric of my pocket. Amid a storm of cruel words, only the feel of that key supported me. After the service, once the complaining relatives finally went home, I noticed a man quietly paying his respects by the memorial photo display. He was an elegant older gentleman in a tailored black suit. He was not a relative. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrison, an old friend of Margaret's. He turned slowly and walked over to me. Ensuring no one else was around, he turned to me with a solemn nod. Elena, thank you for your immense hard work over these long years. The moment I heard that gentle voice, a single tear rolled down my cheek for the first time in 3 days. It was the first warm word spoken to me during this entire agonizing ordeal. Mr. Harrison pulled a crisp white business card from his inside pocket. My name is Harrison. I am the attorney retained by Margaret. Attorney. At that word, I looked up in astonishment. Mr. Harrison dropped his gaze slightly to the pocket of my dress. Did Margaret manage to hand you the key at the very end? I caught my breath and nodded silently. Mr. Harrison smiled, looking somewhat relieved, and placed the business card in my hand. Please come to my office tomorrow. I will hand over the true legacy Margaret left for you. Sitting on a bench at the train station, I held the business card up to the light of a street lamp. Margaret had not just been lying silently in her bed. Realizing her time was running short, she had been moving quietly beneath the surface. Tomorrow, I would visit Mr. Harrison's office. I had no idea yet that this tiny key would open the first door to shattering my husband's arrogant lies. A small nondescript motel near the station. That was my first stop after leaving the empty house. I sat down on the hard mattress of the cramped room and let out a small sigh. The clock on the wall passed 11 at night. Usually, this was the time I would wake up to help turn Margaret over in bed to prevent bed sores. But tonight, the room was so silent it made my ears ring. I unzipped my suitcase. I did not pull out clothes, but an old tablet device. It was a family iPad I used to share with Marcus. When I turned it on, the blue glow of the screen illuminated the dim room. The moment it connected to the Wi-Fi, notifications began pouring in at the top of the screen. I saw one of them and froze my finger. It was an email alert from Marcus's credit card company. Marcus was terrible with technology and had left his primary alert email registered to this old device. I quietly tapped the subject line. The merchant name read Grand Wire Resort, Maui. The charged amount was $3,500. The date and time matched exactly when Margaret was drawing her last breath in that freezing trauma room. I bit my lips slightly as I stared at the screen. No tears fell. Instead, a cold, quiet anger swirled deep in my chest. A few minutes later, a notification popped up from a messaging app on the tablet. The sender was Marcus's sister, Jessica. Jessica had skipped the funeral today, claiming she felt unwell. Elena, I am so sorry about Mom. I am sorry I could not be there. Up to that point, it was a standard condolence message. But as I read the next lines, my brow furrowed in suspicion. Is Marcus really on a business trip in Boston right now? I slowly scrolled down the screen. A friend of mine just texted me. She said she saw Marcus walking arm in arm with a young woman at the airport in Hawaii. It has to be a mistake, right? Marcus' lies were beginning to tear at the seams. He had lied to his relatives, saying he was meeting important clients in Boston. He only told me he was busy with crucial work. Marcus never in a million years considered the possibility that his sister's friend might accidentally be on the same flight. I started typing a reply, then stopped. I could not let them realize that I already knew everything. I closed the tablet screen and placed it on the nightstand. Then I powered my own smartphone back on. The screen lit up showing the blinking voicemail icon. It was the message Marcus had left after I called him 30 times the previous afternoon. I plugged in my earphones and pressed play. "Yeah, it is me. Stop calling me over and over. I am swamped with a crisis at work." It was his usual dismissive, annoyed tone. But what caught my attention was not his voice. It was the faint sound of ocean waves in the background, the refreshing clink of ice in a glass, and the whiny voice of a young woman. "Marcus, hurry up. Let us go to the beach. Did you find out where the old lady keeps her bank accounts?" The moment that sentence jumped into my ears, I gasped. A chill ran straight down my spine. Marcus's slurred voice followed. "Idiot. Keep your voice down. It is fine. Elena is completely clueless. I will tear the house apart and find them as soon as I get back." The message cut off there. I pulled out the earphones and covered my face with freezing hands. The old lady's bank accounts. They were undoubtedly talking about Margaret's life savings. A single memory surged back vividly. It was a night 1 month ago. Marcus had suddenly started ransacking Margaret's room. "Where is Mom's social security card and her vintage savings passbook?" Marcus had frantically pulled out every drawer, tossing things everywhere with bloodshot eyes. When I asked him why, he yelled at me with a deeply panicked face. "I need it for cash flow at my company. You are just a wife. Keep your mouth shut." At that time, I replied that I did not know, as they were Margaret's precious belongings. Indeed, Margaret had never discussed her finances with me. Marcus clicked his tongue violently and stormed out of the house. His panic that day was not about corporate cash flow. He was hunting for the funds to finance his new life or his lavish spending with his mistress. If his mother died, as the eldest son, he assumed he would inherit everything. He was counting his chickens before they hatched. I pulled the small silver key from my pocket, resting on my palm. The key reflected the dim motel lights with a dull gleam. Margaret knew her son was targeting her life savings. That was exactly why she entrusted this key to me, to protect me from her son's betrayal. The next morning, a cloudless blue sky stretched over the city. I changed from my morning dress into a conservative navy blue suit. I left my suitcase with the motel front desk and boarded the train. I headed to a quiet office building a short distance from downtown. On the 3rd floor of an old brick building was the office of Attorney Harrison, the man I met at the funeral. I took a deep breath in front of the door and knocked softly. "Come in." Prompted by a calm voice, I stepped inside. The room was lined with bookshelves and smelled of old paper. Attorney Harrison stood up from his desk and bowed deeply. "I am glad you came, Elena. I have been expecting you." I pulled the small silver key wrapped in a handkerchief from my purse. I placed it quietly on his table. Attorney Harrison looked at the key and gave a small nod. He then retrieved a vintage wooden lockbox from the back of his desk. "Margaret left this in my custody, instructing me to give it to you." The wooden box had a tiny keyhole. It was exactly the right size for the key in my hand. "Please open it. Margaret's true legacy is inside." With trembling fingers, I pinched the key and slid it into the lockbox. Click. The tiny sound echoed in the quiet room. The moment I opened the lid, I lost my words. Inside was not just the bank passbook Marcus had been frantically searching for. There was a thick envelope and a shocking legal document that would drastically alter the course of my life. The box contained a navy blue passbook, a thick envelope with Elena written on it, and an official document. When I read the title of the document, I gasped. Notarized Last Will and Testament. It was printed clearly at the top. "Margaret called me into her room a year ago." Attorney Harrison began speaking quietly. I kept my eyes fixed on the lawyer's face while holding the document. "Margaret knew everything about Marcus's infidelities and the way he treated you. She deeply feared that after she passed away, Marcus would throw you out of the house and burn through her life savings." I reached for the passbook inside the box. I flipped to the last page, and my eyes were glued to the printed balance. $500,000. It was the precious money my father-in-law and Margaret had painstakingly saved over their lifetimes. "Marcus believes he will inherit every penny of Margaret's estate." Mr. Harrison's words brought back the voicemail from yesterday, the mistress asking about the old lady's accounts. Marcus's desperate voice saying he would find them. However, As long as this will exists, things will not go Marcus's way. Attorney Harrison pointed to a specific clause in the document. It detailed a crystal-clear intention. I leave my entire estate, including all monetary assets and property, exclusively to my daughter-in-law, Elena, who devoted years to my care. I expressly and entirely disinherit my son, Marcus. I stared at those words entirely speechless. Something hot surged from deep within my chest. Margaret never saw merely as a convenient in-law providing free nursing care. She understood my struggles and her son's ruthlessness better than anyone else. Margaret told me something. Mr. Harrison's voice resonated in the quiet room. She said, Elena will definitely leave that house when I die. She is too kind, so she will likely walk away empty-handed without demanding a single cent from Marcus. That is why she entrusted this money and this will to you so you could walk proudly into your future without being tied down by anyone. I picked up the thick envelope bearing my name. Inside was a piece of stationery filled with Margaret's shaky handwriting. Elena, thank you so much for the past 20 years. I know how much pain my son caused you. You never cried in front of me, but I knew you were crying alone in the kitchen in the middle of the night. As a mother, I should have fiercely reprimanded him, but in my sickened state, I could not. I am so sorry. This money is my final apology and my gratitude to you. You do not have to stay in that house anymore. Forget about Marcus. Take your life back. Tears dropped onto the stationery one by one. I could no longer hold myself back. Without making a sound, I simply let my shoulders shake as I wept. Attorney Harrison said nothing, gently pushing a box of tissues toward me. How long did I cry? By the time my tears dried up, a single quiet yet ironclad resolve had solidified in my heart. Mr. Harrison. I wiped my tears and looked up. Please keep this will a secret from Marcus for now. Attorney Harrison looked at me slightly surprised. I can do that, but if you inform him immediately, you can legally block him from touching any assets. No. I shook my head slowly. He is currently on a tropical island with his mistress. He is utterly convinced he has one. He plans to kick me out and use this money to fund his new life. I told the lawyer about the divorce papers I had left at the house yesterday and the mistress's voice recorded on his voicemail. I want to dictate the exact moment he is confronted with the truth. My voice was surprisingly cold and steady, even to my own ears. I will slam this reality into his face at the exact moment he feels the most triumphant. The very second he believes he has secured everything. That is my final act of closure for the man who treated Margaret like garbage. Perhaps seeing the fierce light in my eyes, Attorney Harrison nodded deeply. Understood. I will respect your wishes. I am on your side. I am ready to move whenever you need me. When I stepped out of the office, the afternoon sun was shining blindingly bright. I tucked the will, the passbook, and Margaret's letter deep into my purse. Now I possessed 3 weapons. First, the tablet proving his extravagant affair. Second, the signed divorce petition I left behind. And third, this notarized will. I pulled out my smartphone and powered it on again. 10 more missed calls from Marcus appeared on the screen. There was also a single brief text message. I am flying back late tonight. My uncle told me the funeral is over. Do not touch a single thing in my mother's room until I get back. There was not an ounce of grief for his mother's death in those words. There was only a ravenous obsession with her wealth and an arrogant command directed at me. I stared at the screen and smiled quietly. Do not worry. I will not touch a thing because there is nothing left for you to find. When he returns tonight, he will not be greeted by a warm meal or an obedient wife. He will find a pitch-black freezing empty shell of a house. I was looking forward to seeing the look on his face when he found the green divorce papers and the platinum ring left on the dining table. Blue oceans and endless stretches of white sand. Lounging by the pool of the luxury resort in Maui, Marcus poured a cold beer down his throat. Ice clinked refreshingly in his glass. Lying on the white deck chair next to him was Chloe, wearing a red bikini. Marcus, do we really have to fly back tomorrow? Let us stay one more night. Chloe pouted her lips and trailed a finger down his shoulder. Marcus took off his sunglasses and let out a massive annoyed sigh. I do not have a choice. The old bat finally died. As the eldest son, I have to show my face or the relatives will never shut up about it. His voice held absolutely zero sorrow or pain when speaking of his biological mother's death. It sounded as cold as discussing throwing out an old broken piece of furniture. But won't your wife be furious? She had to do all the funeral prep and talk to the directors by herself, right? At Chloe's words, Marcus snorted with laughter. Elena furious? That woman cannot survive a single day without my paycheck. She would never dare go against my orders. She is basically just a highly convenient unpaid maid. Marcus tapped on his smartphone and typed out the brief, commanding message to Elena. Hitting send aggressively, he flashed a triumphant smile at Chloe. Once I get the old lady's inheritance, I will buy you that boutique shop you wanted. As for Elena, I will toss her a tiny bit of severance cash and kick her out of the house. Chloe's eyes sparkled and she hugged Marcus's arm tightly. Really, I am so happy. You are the best. Marcus. Their vulgar laughter was absorbed into the beautiful tropical sky. Around the same time, sitting on a hard chair in the dim motel, I quietly lowered my smartphone. Displayed on the screen was the short message Marcus had just sent. Since the funeral is over, I am flying back tomorrow. You must be thrilled your nursing duties are finally done. I have the house spotless by the time I arrive. The moment I read those words, a pain like a sharp knife twisted deep in my chest. Nursing duties. To my husband, the past 20 years of my life amounted to nothing more than a chore. On the day I married into his family, Marcus had held my hands and said, "Let us build a warm, loving family together." Believing those words, no matter how strict Margaret was, no matter how late Marcus came home, I desperately protected our household. For the 3 years after Margaret collapsed, I did not have a single second of free time for myself. Changing adult diapers in the dead of night, wiping her down to prevent bed sores, blending highly nutritious meals. I did not do it because it was a duty. I did it because she was precious family. Because I genuinely cared for her from the bottom of my heart, shaving away my own life to ensure hers was comfortable. Marcus had simply laughed it off, calling it a chore that I was glad to be rid of. I stared at the screen, grinding my back teeth. My heart physically ached, as if a freezing hand had violently squeezed it. My romantic love for my husband had completely died years ago. Even so, being treated as something less than human by the person I had dedicated half my life to was an unbearable humiliation. I rubbed my thumb hard against the screen, as if I could wipe those callous, cruel words out of existence. My hands shook slightly, cold sweat beading on my palms. However, I did not shed a tear. The old me would have collapsed onto the motel bed, sobbing after seeing this message. I would have felt my life was worthless and sunk into deep despair. But the current me had that small key in the breast pocket of my suit, and sleeping in the bottom of my purse was Margaret's will and her warm letter, "Take your life back." Her gentle voice echoed in the back of my ears. At that moment, the tension inexplicably drained from my trembling fingers. The sorrow and humiliation transformed into a quiet, icy resolve. I took a slow, deep breath and typed on the digital keyboard. "Understood. Have a safe flight." I replied with just that short sentence. No anger, no sorrow, no resentment. Words perfectly imitating the obedient wife I had always been. When Marcus read this message while drinking his cold beer in Hawaii, he would likely laugh in satisfaction, thinking, "See, she can never defy me." He would never dream that this was a fatal trap tightening around his own neck. I powered off my smartphone again and slipped it into my purse. My heart no longer wavered in the slightest. By evening, I stepped out of the motel. The wind was a bit chilly, but the crisp air felt wonderful. I headed to an old, quiet diner a few blocks away. I ordered hot tea and sat at a window booth with little foot traffic. The setting sun painted the town orange, casting long shadows of people hurrying home. I pulled the vintage passbook Attorney Harrison had given me out of my purse. Margaret's navy blue savings ledger. Truthfully, when I opened this passbook at the law office, I had noticed one glaring inconsistency. Shocked by the $500,000 balance on the final page, I hadn't verified it deeply in front of the lawyer. However, in the older pages of this passbook, there was a highly unnatural trail of money that defied explanation. I took a sip of my tea, calmed my nerves, and opened to the very first page. The printed dates were from exactly 20 years ago, the year Marcus and I got married, and started our new life in this town. Lined up on the page were records of a fixed amount, $10,000, being withdrawn on the exact same day every single month. Was it paying off a debt from my father-in-law's funeral or supplementing living expenses? That was my first thought. But those withdrawals ended abruptly a few years later and instead massive irregular sums began being deposited. $50,000, $100,000, sometimes $200,000 at a time. Margaret was a homemaker living on a fixed pension. There was absolutely zero reason for such massive sums to be wired to her. I squinted to verify the name of the depositor. The ink was old and faded, but I traced the letters with my finger to read them. The moment a specific word came into clear focus, I gasped. It was part of the name of a construction company Marcus worked closely with. What does this mean? A small voice leaked from my lips. Margaret's personal bank account and a corporate construction firm. Why were these two completely unrelated entities crossing paths through massive sums of cash 20 years ago? I vividly recalled the image of Marcus frantically tearing apart Margaret's room a few days ago. I need it for cash flow at my company. You are just a wife. Keep your mouth shut. Those words might not have been a simple lie to silence me. Marcus was not just aiming to use Margaret's inheritance for his mistress. If there was a fatal, destructive secret connecting Margaret and Marcus's company in the past, and if what Marcus truly feared was not losing the inheritance, but having that secret exposed to the light of day, I traced the old records with my finger again. An unnatural massive flow of money starting 20 years ago and continuing to the present. It was like an entryway into a deep darkness my husband had cultivated for decades. I pulled the old family tablet out of my purse. My secondary piece of evidence to completely shatter Marcus's lies and back him into a corner with no escape. I had to solve the mystery of this passbook. I needed to assemble every piece of the truth before he returned to the city with his mistress. The quiet footsteps of the approaching end did not belong to Marcus. They were the footsteps of ruin I had prepared for him. I stared out the window at the sinking sun with cold, quiet eyes. In the diner, now completely dark outside, I stared at my cold tea. Spread on the table were the vintage passbook and the tablet Marcus used to use. I operated the tablet, opening the inbox of Marcus's old email account. It contained records from several years ago when he still used the device. In the search bar, I typed the name of the construction company printed in the passbook, Horizon Builders, along with the word wire. The screen froze for a second before displaying several old emails. The moment I opened the first one, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The sender was the president of Horizon Builders, Marcus's uncle Richard. Marcus, regarding the consulting fees for the recent project, we have wired the funds to Margaret's designated account. I held my breath and checked the corresponding date in the passbook. $100,000. The date of the email and the date the funds hit. The account matched flawlessly. Marcus was taking corporate bribes and illegal kickbacks from his uncle's subcontracting firm. If he had them wired to his own account, his company would find out immediately. That was why he used his bedridden mother's account as an invisible vault. Margaret surely never dreamed her passbook was being used for a federal crime. Wait, did she really not know? I turned to the last page of the passbook, the most recent records. Exactly 6 months before Margaret passed away, the transfers from Horizon Builders abruptly stopped. Instead, there was a record of Margaret going to the bank teller herself to have the passbook reissued and frozen to external deposits. The dots silently connected in my mind. Margaret had realized from her bed what Marcus was doing. To prevent her son from committing any more crimes, or perhaps as a trump card to protect me, she contacted Mr. Harrison and hid the physical passbook where Marcus could not reach it. The true reason Marcus was desperately hunting for the passbook that night was not just to steal the inheritance for his mistress. It was to completely destroy the evidence of his corporate fraud before Margaret died. If the existence of this passbook reached his company or the authorities, Marcus wouldn't just be fired. He would face federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. That was why he was so frantic. When I understood everything, the last microscopic shred of empathy I had for Marcus shattered loudly. What remained was only cold contempt for a man who would use his own mother. At 9 the next morning, as soon as the doors opened, I walked into the local bank branch Margaret had used for years. I took a numbered ticket and waited quietly. Around me were retirees withdrawing cash and housewives making deposits. A perfectly normal, mundane scene. In the midst of it, I was the only one about to light the fuse on the first bomb that would end my husband's life as he knew it. Ticket 112, please go to the counter. Called by the banker, I sat down. From my purse, I pulled out a certified copy of Margaret's death certificate. I slid it quietly across the counter. My mother-in-law, Margaret, passed away yesterday. I need to process her accounts. The female teller gasped slightly and immediately bowed her head. I am so very sorry for your loss. I will begin the process immediately. The clacking of the keyboard echoed softly. A few minutes later, she began explaining. We have confirmed the passing and per federal banking regulations, we have immediately frozen Margaret's accounts. until the formal probate and inheritance legalities are concluded by the family. No cash withdrawals or transfers can be made whatsoever. Thank you. That is perfectly fine. I replied briefly, bowed, and left the bank. The bright morning sun illuminated my face. This was my first small counterattack, freezing the account. It is standard procedure when an account holder dies. But Marcus had likely forgotten this, or arrogantly assumed no one would start the paperwork until he returned. If he flew back today and tried to use a debit card to access his slush fund, or tried to move the inheritance for his mistress, the ATM screen would simply display a sterile error. This card cannot be processed. The 20 years of lies he had hidden were now entirely locked away in a dark vault. I felt a tiny refreshing breeze blow through the depths of my chest. Leaving the bank, I headed to the house one last time. The empty shell Marcus would return to this evening. I unlocked the door and stepped into the dead silent living room. This would be the absolute last time I ever stood here. I placed the green divorce petition on the dining table. Then I placed the wedding band I had worn for 20 years squarely on top of the document. The platinum clinked coldly against the paper. But that was not all. I pulled out a piece of paper I had printed at the motel yesterday. It was a photocopy of the oldest page of Margaret's passbook showing the illegal kickbacks alongside the newest page showing the $500,000 balance. I laid this photocopy right next to the divorce papers. I deliberately did not write a letter. I left no excuses and no resentments. But the absolute to me for Kate of this photocopy. He would understand to the very marrow of his bones that I knew everything when I walked out. The clock passed 3 inches the afternoon. Marcus's flight would land soon. I took one final look around the house and walked to the entryway. I closed the door, locked it, and dropped the key into the mailbox. I would never open this door again. While walking toward the station, my smartphone vibrated softly. It was a text from Marcus. Just landed at the airport. I will be home for dinner. Make sure you handle writing the thank you cards for the funeral attendees. Also, fry up my favorite chicken for dinner. The words of a man returning from a trip with his mistress, barking orders at a wife who had just finished burying his mother. I stared at the callous text and laughed without making a sound. Yes, have a safe trip home, I whispered in my heart. When you open that door, there will be no warm dinner and no obedient wife. All you will find is a cold divorce petition, and the criminal evidence you feared most, and the money you are relying on cannot be touched. The train I boarded sped in the complete opposite direction of the airport. Gazing at the scenery flying past the window, I turned my thoughts toward my new life, imagining the furious roars that would echo in that dark house a few hours from now. The airport terminal for the direct flight from Hawaii was bustling with travelers. Walking through the lobby, Marcus sported a tanned face and a highly satisfied smile. Beside him, Chloe happily carried several high-end designer shopping bags. Ugh, the air in the city is terrible. Let us go back to the island next month, Marcus. When Chloe wowed, Marcus nodded expansively. Yeah, sure. Next month, we can fly somewhere further internationally. There was not a shred of mourning for his newly deceased mother in either of their minds. To Marcus, his mother's death was merely a liberation from an annoying burden. But Marcus, won't your relatives be mad that you missed the funeral? When Chloe asked nervously, Marcus snorted, I will just feed those relatives some random lie. He began boasting about his flawless plan. I am going to tell them I was in Boston, resolving a massive corporate crisis. I will say Elena messed up and didn't contact me in time. I will pin the whole thing on her. Poor thing. Won't your wife be furious? Chloe covered her mouth with a fake laugh. Furious. Elena cannot survive a single day without me. Marcus looked down on his wife from the absolute bottom of his heart. The woman who had taken on his caregiving burdens for 20 years without a single complaint. He was convinced she was just a convenient maid who could never defy him. Besides, the old lady's inheritance belongs entirely to me. I am the eldest son. It is only natural. Marcus's goal was the $500,000 cash and the property value of the house. If he got his hands on all of it, he could quit his job and start his own business. He could buy Chloe a luxury condo. I will toss Elena a little bit of hush money and kick her out. She does not have the brains to hire a lawyer or demand alimony. Walking through the automatic doors of the airport, Marcus was utterly convinced of his brilliant future. He was the winner and his wife was an eternal loser. He had no idea that his arrogant calculations had already been utterly obliterated. Around that same time, I was looking out at the city lights from the window of my quiet motel room. In my hand was Margaret's letter. No matter how many times I read it, I could feel her deep love and agonizing regret pouring from the words. Marcus was always a cold child who only thought of himself. Midway through the letter, Margaret revealed her true feelings about her son for the first time. Perhaps it was because my husband died early and I spoiled the boy too much. I realized a few years ago that he was doing something illegal at his company. I tightened my grip on the letter. Margaret had noticed the unnatural massive deposits hitting her account. I confronted Marcus, but he snapped at me and screamed in my face. Ever since then, he treated me like a nuisance and forced all the caregiving onto you. Margaret knew of her son's crimes, but could not bring herself to turn him over to the police. How much she must have suffered. Torn between a mother's love and doing what was right. Elena. I did not have the courage to judge my own son with my own hands. I am truly sorry. But I cannot let you be sacrificed any longer. The thing Margaret truly wanted to protect was not the money. It was letting me escape from her son's crimes and his cruel domination. To allow me to walk into a new life on my own 2 feet. That was her final wish and her atonement to me. Margaret. I pressed the letter gently to my chest and closed my eyes. I felt as though her trembling hands were gently pushing my back. My husband had conveniently used and trampled over both me and his mother. Confronting him with the truth was the greatest tribute I could offer her. I took a deep breath, etching a cold, clear resolve into my heart. At 8, well after dark, Marcus stepped out of a taxi in front of the house. Looking up while pulling his suitcase, he noticed the house was unnaturally pitch black. Not a single sliver of light leaked from the living room windows. Why does she have all the lights off? Marcus clicked his tongue in irritation and turned the doorknob, but it was locked and would not open. Damn it. I texted her I was coming home. Is this her idea of a joke? Marcus pulled his key from his bag and aggressively unlocked the door. Hey Elena, I am back. What the hell are you doing? Marcus's angry shout echoed through the dark entryway, but there was no reply from inside the house. It was eerily silent. Normally his wife would come jogging in a panic to greet him. There was no warm smell of dinner, no sound of life, nothing at all. Where are you hiding? Do not mess with me. I am not playing games. Marcus kicked off his shoes and stormed into the living room. His face flushed with anger. He violently slapped the wall switch, turning on the lights. The bright fluorescent light illuminated the familiar living room, but his wife was nowhere to be seen. The room was unnaturally spotless, and all traces of her existence had completely vanished. It was a cold space, like a staged model home nobody lived in. What is going on? Suspicious. Marcus scanned the room. Then his eyes stopped dead on the dining table. Sitting alone in the dead center of the empty table was an unfamiliar stack of papers. Marcus furrowed his brow, let go of his suitcase, and approached the table. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage. The moment he read the words, Marcus let out a short scoff. Ha! Running away from home. What a pathetic threat. If his wife was leaving on her own, it meant he wouldn't have to pay alimony. It was a bit annoying. But he actually thought it worked perfectly for his plans. Resting on top of the divorce papers, gleaming coldly, was a platinum wedding band. Maintaining a smirk of superiority, Marcus shifted his gaze to the piece of paper right next to it. It was just a black and white photocopy, but the instant he saw the text and numbers printed on it, the smirk was completely wiped from his face. It was a photocopy of his mother's old savings passbook. The exact page showing the illegal kickbacks he had received from the subcontracting firm 20 years ago. The criminal evidence that absolutely no one could ever be allowed to see. Furthermore, next to it was a copy of the most recent balance. It clearly displayed the $500,000 figure he had been planning to steal. What the hell is this? Marcus's throat made a wheezing sound, and the blood instantly drained from his legs. Why did his wife know about this passbook? Why was this copy here? His wife was supposed to be a clueless, stupid woman. Marcus picked up the paper with a trembling hand. His fingertips shook violently. At that moment, Marcus realized his allegedly perfect plan had been completely seen through from the very beginning, and the wife he looked down on had already finished preparing to push him over the edge of despair. What is this? What the hell is going on? Marcus's voice cracked into a shriek that echoed through the empty living room. The black and white copy in his hand shook uncontrollably. It clearly showed the evidence of his 20-year-old corporate fraud, and it showed the $500,000 balance he had counted on. The secrets he desperately needed to hide had been fully exposed by his wife. With a bloodless face, Marcus whipped his head around frantically. Hey, Elena, where are you? Come out." Thinking his wife might be hiding somewhere to test him, he violently threw open the doors to the bedroom, the bathroom, and his newly deceased mother's room. But the house remained eerily silent. Her clothes were entirely gone from the closet. Her toothbrush and cosmetics were missing from the vanity. His wife had seriously packed up her entire life and vanished. "You have got to be kidding me. How much does that know?" Sweating cold bullets, Marcus returned to the living room. He glared at the divorce papers and the ring on the table. Far worse than his wife demanding a divorce was the sheer terror of having evidence of a federal crime in her hands. If the original passbook fell into the hands of corporate compliance or the FBI, he would undoubtedly be fired with cause and potentially arrested for embezzlement and fraud. The career he built, his life with his mistress, everything would disintegrate into nothing. "Damn it, calm down. She hasn't leaked it yet," Marcus muttered to himself like a mantra and pulled his smartphone from his pocket. With trembling fingers, he dialed his wife's number. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." The cold robotic voice played and Marcus nearly smashed his phone into the floor. She had cancelled her cell service, completely cutting off his only means of contacting her. His perfect plan was being brutally dismantled by his wife's hands. Facing this reality, Marcus began to feel a deep terror that eclipsed his anger. The wife he had treated like dirt suddenly felt like a terrifying monster. The passbook. "I have to find the original." Marcus dove into his mother's room with bloodshot eyes. He ripped out dresser drawers, scattering clothes across the floor. Old boxes in the back of the closet, under the bed, between bookshelves. He tore the house apart like a desperate burglar. But no matter how hard he searched, the vintage passbook was nowhere to be found. The social security card, the deed to the house, everything was gone. An hour later, in the middle of the trashed room, Marcus collapsed onto the floor, panting heavily, covered in sweat and dust. His eyes were hollow and unfocused. His wife had calculated everything and taken it all. Just then, his smartphone, lying on the floor, rang. The screen displayed Chloe's name. Marcus lunged for the phone as if grabbed by an invisible wire. "Hello, Chloe. What is wrong? You are taking forever. Is your wife mad?" The carefree, sweet voice of his mistress now sounded agonizingly grating to Marcus's ears. "Chloe, we have a problem." Marcus's voice was hollow and steeped in panic. "A problem? Do not tell me you didn't get your mom's inheritance, idiot. Keep your voice down. Forget the inheritance. Elena took the evidence of the thing I did in the past." He heard Chloe gasp over the phone. Chloe had vaguely known about Marcus's past corporate fraud. That was exactly why she realized his panic was deadly serious. "Wait a second. Does that mean you are going to get arrested?" The sweetness instantly vanished from her voice. "I am not getting arrested. I will fix this. I am calling a family meeting tomorrow." Marcus glared at the ceiling of the trashed room with bloodshot eyes. "A family meeting, right? Elena cut contact with me, but she has to contact someone in the family eventually. She is too dutiful not to. I will manipulate my uncles into summoning her. Then, in front of everyone, I will corner her and force her to hand over the passbook." Marcus's thought process was endlessly self-centered and shallow. He truly believed that if he backed his wife into a corner psychologically, she would submit immediately. He had not yet realized she was no longer the woman who simply endured the abuse. "Anyway, do not contact me for a while. I will get that money no matter what." Marcus hung up unilaterally. In the dark room, Marcus grounded his teeth. "That I will not let her get away with this. Do not underestimate me." There was no apology to his wife or mourning for his mother in his heart. Only an obsessive instinct for self-preservation and a desperate clinging to money. The next morning, I was drinking hot tea in the quiet motel room. Not a single relative had contacted me since yesterday. Was Marcus still hiding my departure from them, or had they completely written me off? Either way, it no longer mattered to me. I had an appointment to strategize with Attorney Harrison today. I had the front desk call a taxi and headed to his office. When I walked in, Mr. Harrison greeted me with his usual calm smile. "Good morning, Elena. Were you able to get some sleep?" "Yes, thank you. Surprisingly well." I smiled slightly and pulled a document from my purse. It was something I had secretly prepared over the past few days. Mr. Harrison. He should have seen the documents I left at the house. He will make his move soon. I placed the document on the desk. Mr. Harrison reviewed it and gave a small nod. "I see. Marcus will undoubtedly panic and try to drag the extended family into this. To hide his own fraud, He will try to frame you as a thief who absconded with the estate. No, that is exactly why I will be the one setting the trap for them." At my words, Mr. Harrison looked slightly surprised, his eyes widening. I shed the face of the enduring wife of 20 years and smiled quietly but coldly. The preparations to shove my husband off the cliff exactly when he felt the most triumphant were completely in place. The day after returning to the city from the tropical island, Chloe was nervously biting her nails on her apartment sofa. The sweet vacation atmosphere had been completely obliterated by Marcus's phone call. Elena took the evidence of the thing I did in the past. Marcus's screeching voice was glued to her eardrums. Chloe had only dated Marcus because he was on the executive track at his company and spent lavishly. And most importantly, because she heard a massive inheritance from his dying mother was coming soon. But if Marcus was outed for embezzlement, the whole game changed. Forget inheritance. If he got arrested, he would be buried under civil lawsuits and restitution. You have got to be kidding me. I am not going down with a sinking ship. Chloe clicked her tongue and aggressively operated her smartphone. Without hesitation, she deleted every single sweet message history with Marcus. Next, she pulled out the credit card Marcus had given her free rein to use. I need to buy everything I can while this still works. She opened a luxury brand website, added a $5,000 watch to her cart, and confidently hit checkout. However, a red error message appeared on the screen. This card is currently unavailable. Chloe's eyes went wide. Sensing the danger, Marcus had immediately canceled or frozen all his credit cards. That selfish bastard only cares about saving his own skin. Chloe threw her smartphone onto the sofa. In her mind, a man named Marcus lost all value and crashed to the floor. She immediately began preparations to flee the sinking ship. Around the same time, I was quietly drinking tea in Attorney Harrison's office. "Elena, may I ask you one thing, mister?" Harrison looked at me with a slightly puzzled expression. "You noticed Marcus's affair a few months ago, correct? Why didn't you confront him immediately?" I gently wrapped both hands around my teacup. The warmth seeped into my cold palms. If I had made a scene, he would have taken it out on Margaret. I answered in a quiet voice. My husband was the kind of man who would immediately raise his voice if things didn't go his way. If I confronted him about the affair, he would have played the victim, screaming that I ignored him because I only cared about the house. And worst of all, he might have literally kicked Margaret out and forced her into a terrible nursing facility. Margaret could not speak, but she understood everything perfectly. She knew she wouldn't live long if she was put in a facility. I stared at the teacup and continued. I wanted to protect Margaret's final days in that house so she could pass peacefully. While he was out playing with his mistress, I was able to stay by Margaret's side and hold her hand. That alone gave my silence enough meaning. Mr. Harrison nodded deeply. "Now I understand perfectly why Margaret left her entire estate to you. You truly were the real daughter Margaret never had." His words almost made me cry, but I held the tears back. I had decided I would only cry when everything was over, and I went to report to Margaret's grave. Just then, the office phone rang loudly. The receptionist answered, looking slightly troubled, and glanced at Mr. Harrison. "Sir, it is a call from a man named Richard, Marcus's uncle. He is demanding to speak to Elena. And he is extremely aggressive." I exchanged a glance with Mr. Harrison. My husband had made his move. Just as I predicted, having lost all means to contact me directly, he had mobilized the relatives to apply pressure. Mr. Harrison took the receiver and put it on speakerphone. "Hey, Elena is there, isn't she? Put her on." The booming voice of Uncle Richard, who had screamed at me at the funeral, echoed from the speaker. "I am Attorney Harrison representing her. I can assist you with your business. I don't care if you are an attorney or the Pope. That woman stole Margaret's passbook and social security card and ran off while Marcus was away." I let out a quiet sigh. Marcus had lied to his relatives, claiming I was a thief who stole the inheritance. Hiding his affair and corporate fraud entirely, he set me up as the villain. Marcus is a wreck right now. He is mourning his dead mother. And on top of that, his own wife robs him blind. Richard's words almost made me burst into cold laughter. Mourning his dead mother. How could he spew such a brazen lie? "We are meeting at the house tomorrow at noon to discuss the estate," Richard shouted aggressively. "Marcus and I will be there. You tell Elena she better show up. If she hands over the financial records and signs the settlement, Marcus won't press theft charges. Tell her to be grateful." When Mr. Harrison tried to argue back, I silently raised a hand to stop him. I leaned toward the speakerphone and spoke clearly. Uncle Richard. It is me. There was a slight pause on the other end as if Richard had choked on his words. Noon tomorrow, right? Understood. I will absolutely be there. H realized you can't run, huh? You better bring that passbook. Richard spat out the words and slammed the phone down. The sterile dial tone echoed in the office. I sat back deeply in my chair and bowed my head to Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, could I ask you to accompany me tomorrow? Of course. Marcus intends to use the sheer numbers of the family to crush you into submission, but they are making a massive miscalculation. Yes, they probably think I am shivering and crying alone. I pulled a photocopy of the green divorce petition from my purse along with a tiny black object. It was a micro recorder I had hidden in Margaret's room. It clearly allows an audio of Marcus ransacking the room and screaming, "I need it for cash flow at my company." A family meeting functioning as a witch trial. They intended to hang me out to dry, strip me of the passbook, and throw me out onto the street with nothing. Marcus was likely planning to hide behind his relatives and mock me from a safe distance. However, in his panic, Marcus had made one fatal mistake. He thought he had the relatives on his side, but how would they react when they learned the 20-year-old lie he was hiding? I silently traced the copy of the passbook with my fingertip. Hidden in this vintage passbook was another secret that would drain the blood from not just Marcus's face, but the faces of the relatives as well. Thinking about the exact moment their shallow arrogance would shatter in the living room tomorrow noon. Even the slightest tremble vanished from my hands entirely. At noon the next day, accompanied by Mr. Harrison, I arrived at the childhood home where Marcus's relatives were gathered. The distinct smell of an old house mixed with faint memorial candles hit my nose. In the living room, there was no family gathering, just the two men who had the most to lose. Uncle Richard stood aggressively by the fireplace, acting as Marcus's muscle. Marcus sat at the dining table, wearing a meticulously crafted face of utter exhaustion. When we entered the room, the cold stares of the relatives pierced me all at once. No one offered a greeting. The atmosphere was heavy and freezing, as if a criminal had just been dragged in. Without flinching, I took a seat near the door with Mr. Harrison. I straightened my back and rested my hands quietly on my lap. My hands were no longer shaking at all. You actually showed up instead of running away, Elena. The first to break the silence was Uncle Richard. He glared at me and spoke in a booming, intimidating voice. Marcus told us everything. While we were grieving Margaret's death, you broke into the safe and stole her passbook and important documents. Are you not ashamed to call yourself a human being, let alone a wife? Taking his cue, Aunt Susan let out an exaggerated sigh. Truly unbelievable. Marcus is flying all over the country, working himself to the bone, and you sneak around like a common thief behind his back. Margaret must be rolling in her grave. I silently scanned the faces of the relatives one by one. I could perfectly see how many convenient lies my husband had fed them about grieving and working himself to the bone. Marcus was deceiving his own family, turning me into a unilateral villain to hide his crimes. Marcus theatrically lowered his eyes and spoke. Elena, I am so incredibly shocked by my mother's passing. I do not want to believe you are the kind of person who would do something so horrible. His voice, dripping with victimhood, brought genuine nausea to my stomach. The man who drank beer on a tropical island with his mistress while his mother was dying. How dared he speak of grief? Give it back. Elena. That is our family's crucial inheritance. It is not something an outsider like you can just walk away with. Marcus looked down at me, declaring it coldly. In his eyes, I could see the firm conviction. You can never defy me. He believed that by gathering the family as an army, I would break down crying and obediently hand over the passbook. We know you took the financial documents, Elena. Richard barked, slamming his hand on the mantel. That belongs to the estate, not you. Marcus slid a folder across the table toward me. Give the documents back. Elena. In exchange, I'll be generous. Sign this settlement agreement and the divorce papers. You agree to walk away with no alimony, and I won't call the police for grand theft. Attached to it was a selfishly drafted waiver stipulating that I would surrender all rights to alimony and marital assets. They were entirely convinced they had already won. Strip me bare, kick me out, and secure the $500,000 inheritance for Marcus. That was the sole purpose of this witch trial. However, looking at the divorce petition, my expression did not change in the slightest. I took a quiet breath and looked straight into Richard's eyes. I decline at my short, Crystal clear response. The air in the room froze instantly. Richard's face flushed red with rage. What did you say? You think a thief like you gets to run her mouth? Marcus also stood up and yelled at me. Hey Elena, if that is how you want to play it, I will call the police right now. You want to go to federal prison for grand theft? At that moment, Mr. Harrison, sitting next to me, quietly spoke up. You are welcome to call the police. However, you cannot charge her with theft. Margaret's accounts have already been frozen. And more importantly, Elena is the sole legal beneficiary. Mr. Harrison's calm voice stopped Marcus dead in his tracks. Beneficiary? What kind of garbage are you talking about? I am the eldest son. Mom's inheritance belongs entirely to me. Obviously. Marcus screamed, spitting as he spoke. Mr. Harrison's expression did not change. He pulled a thick envelope from his briefcase. While she was alive, Margaret drafted a notarized last will and testament. She explicitly left her entire estate to Elena, who dedicated her life to her care. In other words, Marcus, you have absolutely zero legal right to receive a single penny of her assets. What? A dumbfounded noise leaked from Marcus's mouth. Both Richard and Susan stared at Mr. Harrison in sheer disbelief. It is a fake. That forged it. I know she did. Marcus screamed, his face bright red, but his voice was trembling slightly. A will drafted and notarized officially carries absolute legal authority. His calculation that he would inherit everything shattered with a loud crack at this very moment. As her attorney, I can easily prove the authenticity of the will. When Mr. Harrison stated this coldly, the relatives broke into an uproar. Marcus, what is the meaning of this? This is not what you told us. Richard desperately interrogated Marcus. Sweating profusely, Marcus yelled back, do not listen to him. The lawyer is in on the scam. They still only had money on their minds, completely unaware that I had not yet played the weapon that would truly destroy them. I placed my hands quietly on the table and looked directly at Marcus. Marcus, I have the receipts and the joyful audio recordings from when you were at the hotel in Maui with your mistress, Chloe. Should I play them for the relatives right here? The moment that sentence dropped into the room, every ounce of blood vanished from Marcus's face. Marcus stared at me as if he had just seen a ghost, lost his words, and slumped back into his chair. Aunt Susan let out a high-pitched squeak. Maui mistress? What does she mean, Marcus? I opened my purse and pulled out a black and white photocopy. It was the copy of the vintage passbook that had terrified Marcus in the dark house yesterday. I did not place it in front of Marcus. I placed it gently in front of Uncle Richard at the head of the table. Uncle Richard, before you call me a thief, please take a look at these records. Frowning in irritation, Richard picked up the paper. What is this garbage? It is just a copy of an old passbook. Please pay close attention to the dates and the name of the depositor, prompted by my cold voice. Richard put on his reading glasses and peered at the document. Dates from 20 years ago and clearly printed next to them the name Horizon Builders. The moment he saw it, Richard's hands began to shake violently. Why is this? Richard's face turned the color of ash. His overbearing attitude from moments ago was entirely gone. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Horizon Builders. That was the subcontracting firm Richard owned 20 years ago in exchange for Marcus feeding his uncle lucrative corporate contracts. Richard had continuously paid illegal kickbacks to Marcus over several years. They used Margaret's account as a shield. The very people trying to judge me at this family meeting were the greatest criminals in the room. The dirty secret Marcus and Richard had kept buried for decades was now dragged out into the light right in front of the entire family. The air in the room instantly morphed from anger into bottomless terror and confusion. No one could utter a word. A heavy silence crushed down on them. Without breaking my posture, I stared quietly back at their faces, which were now dyed in despair. Silence descended heavily and coldly over the room. Uncle Richard's hands kept trembling convulsively. The black and white copy he held made a dry rustling sound. What? What is it, Richard? What is written there? Aunt Susan looked bewildered and tried to peek at his hands. Instantly, Richard snatched the paper to his chest like a man possessed and crushed it into a ball. Nothing. It is nonsense. It is an absolute forgery made by this woman. He shouted loudly, but his voice was completely cracked. Greasy sweat beaded on Richard's forehead. His eyes darted around, his breathing shallow. It was obvious to everyone that he was panicking beyond reason. The relatives who had been aggressively treating me like a thief a moment ago completely changed their expressions. The overbearing atmosphere warped into something deeply unsettling. They were not stupid. Seeing Richard's unnatural panic, they realized something incredibly damning was written on that paper. My husband Marcus remained slumped in his chair, unable to utter a single syllable, crushed by the weight of the reality that I held the evidence of his lifelong fraud. His face was pale, his lips turning purple. I straightened my back quietly and spoke to Richard, who was clutching the crushed paper. It is not a forgery. The original passbook is securely locked in a safe at Mr. Harrison's law firm. It is ready to be submitted to a forensic audit or the FBI at any moment. My voice was surprisingly cold and clear, even to myself. A voice devoid of anger or sorrow, simply stating facts. For several years starting 2 decades ago, massive sums were regularly transferred from Horizon Builders to Margaret's personal account. Uncle Richard, you were the owner of Horizon Builders at that time, were you not? I could hear the relatives in the room gasp for air. Horizon Builders is a subcontractor for Summit Engineering where Marcus works. And Marcus was the purchasing manager with the authority to award those contracts. Marcus took kickbacks in exchange for granting favors to your company. He hid the money not in his own account but in his bedridden mother's. Am I wrong? No. I don't know anything. Marcus suddenly shrieked at the top of his lungs. That is right. Mom did that on her own. Mom teamed up with Richard to embezzle company funds. I didn't know anything about it. The moment those words echoed through the room, the atmosphere shifted entirely from terror to utter disgust. To save his own skin, Marcus had just tried to pin federal crimes on his biological mother, whose funeral they had just held. Marcus, do you seriously intend to frame your own mother? Aunt Susan looked down at him in sheer disbelief. The other relatives also began backing away from Marcus, looking at him as if he were a pile of filth. A few minutes ago, they had defended him, saying he worked hard and was grieving. Not anymore. Witnessing his bottomless depravity and selfishness, the so-called family bond evaporated in an instant. I simply watched Marcus's grotesque display without a hint of emotion. This was the true face of the man I had served for 20 years. I didn't even feel anger, only profound pity. Just then, Mr. Harrison quietly checked his watch. It appears our guest has arrived right on schedule. Just after Mr. Harrison spoke, the heavy front door of the house rattled open loudly. Hello, is Attorney Harrison here? A calm yet imposing deep male voice echoed from the hallway. The relatives all turned their heads toward the hall in confusion. Footsteps approached and the door to the living room opened. Standing there was an older gentleman in a tailored dark suit. He had sharp, unforgiving eyes and a flawless, stern expression, a complete outsider whom none of the relatives recognized. However, the second Marcus saw the man's face, he let out a short shriek, covered his face with both hands, and collapsed onto the floor. Miss Sterling, Marcus's trembling voice, heavy with despair, echoed through the room. The man called Sterling was the director of compliance at Summit Engineering. Marcus's strict corporate boss, Mr. Sterling stepped into the room and bowed deeply to Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison, thank you for contacting me today. I apologize for coming all this way. I believed it would be faster for the compliance department to hear this directly. Mr. Sterling nodded, then aimed a ruthless glare at Marcus, who was crawling on the floor. Marcus, yesterday, Mr. Harrison sent a very interesting photocopy to my desk. A copy of a passbook showing a highly opaque flow of money between you and a former subcontractor. Marcus's shoulders violently jolted. The relatives were completely frozen. The ultimate family shame had been entirely exposed to the upper management of Marcus's company. Terrified of being implicated, everyone held their breath and looked at the floor. Mr. Sterling continued in a quiet tone that allowed zero escape. The statute of limitations for the crimes 20 years ago may have passed. However, our company has a zero-tolerance compliance policy. Even if the fraud is in the past, once the facts are verified, termination with cause is inevitable. Naturally, your pension and severance will be completely voided. No severance, terminated with cause. Those words meant the absolute end of Marcus's life. The arrogant man who planned to laugh with his mistress in Hawaii and start a business with a $500,000 inheritance saw his future completely annihilated in a matter of minutes. And it seems the fraud doesn't stop there. Mr. Sterling narrowed his eyes. We have already investigated the fact that you filed expenses claiming to be on a business trip to Boston this week when you were actually vacationing in Hawaii using corporate funds for a personal trip. This is blatant embezzlement. Hearing that, Aunt Susan gasped. Hawaii? The lie Marcus had fed the family about flying around the country for work was utterly destroyed here. Richard, terrified that his own crimes would be prosecuted, tried to stand up on shaking legs. I am leaving. I have nothing to do with this, but Mr. Sterling pierced Richard with ice-cold eyes. The former owner of Horizon Builders, correct? You will be hearing from our corporate attorneys shortly. Do not think you can run away. Richard collapsed back to the floor, holding his head and letting out a low groan. I looked down quietly at the crumbling men. This was the form of revenge Margaret had entrusted to me. While alive, Margaret had confessed everything to Mr. Harrison, instructing him to send the evidence straight to the company if anything happened to her, to end the life of the son she loved with her own hands. How agonizing and heartbreaking that decision must have been. Thinking of Margaret's deep despair, my chest tightened painfully. Marcus kept shaking his head frantically, his eyes unfocused. No, not me. I will pay the money back. Please, just let me go. No one listened to a word he said. The trap called a family meeting had transformed into a prison, locking them in forever. However, Mr. Harrison hadn't closed his briefcase yet. Mr. Sterling, thank you for joining us. I leave Marcus's corporate matters in your capable hands. Mr. Harrison scanned the room. Then, he slowly pulled an old envelope from his bag. Now, we move on to the final matter regarding Marcus and Elena as a family. This envelope contains another truth Margaret left behind right before she died. Marcus flinched, staring at the envelope with bloodshot eyes. Margaret's true final words, the contents of which even I didn't know. The room was engulfed in even thicker tension as everyone waited for the next words. The old envelope pulled from Mr. Harrison's bag. It had been carefully preserved for years, its edges slightly yellowed, carrying the faint scent of a memorial candle. Margaret instructed me to open this only if Marcus showed absolutely no remorse. At the very end, Mr. Harrison placed the envelope in the center of the table. But before we open this, Elena, let us have everyone listen to the audio you mentioned earlier. I nodded quietly, pulling my smartphone from my purse. I operated the screen and played the saved voicemail. In the heavy silence, the electronic beep sounded small. Yeah, it is me. Stop calling me over and over. I am swamped with a crisis at work. My husband's irritated voice played from the small speaker. The relatives immediately frowned. In the background of that audio, the pleasant sound of crashing waves and ice clinking in a glass could be heard clearly. Marcus's lie about a work crisis crumbled instantly from that sound alone. Then came the fatal blow. Marcus, hurry up. Let us go to the beach. Did you find out where the old lady keeps her bank accounts? The disgustingly sweet, callous voice of a young woman. I felt the air in the room snap and freeze. Aunt Susan, who had defended Marcus earlier, sat with her mouth hanging wide open in disbelief. Idiot. Keep your voice down. It is fine. Elena is completely clueless. I will tear the house apart and find them as soon as I get back. His slurred voice echoed and the audio abruptly cut off, returning the room to silence. I placed the phone face down on the table and looked over the frozen relatives. This is the true face of Marcus's grief recorded while Margaret was turning cold in the emergency room. My calm but icy voice rang through the room. He lied about a business trip to take a tropical vacation with his mistress. And in the very moment his biological mother was drawing her last breath, the only thing he was thinking about, laughing about, was how to find her inheritance and spend it on his plaything. Disgusting. Unbelievable. The one who broke the silence was Aunt Susan. She glared down at Marcus on the floor with eyes reserved for something repulsive. Claiming you were suffering at work. Claiming you were grieving your mother. How could you tell us such filthy lies right to our faces? Do you not have a human heart? A barrage of insults began flying at Marcus from the other relatives. Skipping your own mother's funeral to travel with a mistress. You lied to us, too. Have you no shame? Margaret will never rest in peace. The relatives who had united to attack me as a thief mere moments ago, entirely flipped and became a mob crucifying Marcus. Ultimately, they only cared about appearances and their own self-interest. There was absolutely no reason for them to side with a man whose fraud was exposed and who was being exiled from his company. Marcus was thrown into an absolute panic by the cold arrows of condemnation flying from all sides. No, she invited me. I did not even want to go. He piled on pathetic excuses, looking around desperately for help, but not a single person would meet his eyes. Looking down at his miserable state, Mr. Sterling let out a deep sigh. Beyond saving to betray not just the company's funds, but your own family's hearts. I am leaving. Miss Sterling stood up, dropping a gaze like ice onto Marcus. Marcus, the formal termination notice will arrive from HR tomorrow. You will not receive a single cent of severance. Prepare to pack your desk, Mr. Sterling left the room with those final cold words. The heavy thud of the front door closing signaled the absolute end of Marcus's professional life. Having lost everything with nowhere left to run, Marcus suddenly began laughing like a broken machine. Huh? Fine, fire me. I am cutting ties with you heartless relatives anyway. He stood up and aimed his bloodshot, eerie eyes at me. Elena, hurry up and submit those divorce papers and get the hell out. I still have Chloe. She is young and beautiful. I don't need a useless woman like you anyway. I am going to start a new life with her. It was the very last shred of his pride. A fragile thread he was desperately clinging to. Even if he was fired and abandoned by his family, he believed the young woman who loved him would stay by his side. That delusion was the only thing keeping him standing. However, I stared back at him without a single trace of pity. Start over? With what money exactly? At my quiet question, Marcus's manic laughter slammed to a halt. Chloe was with you because you were on the executive track and spent lavishly, wasn't she? And most importantly, because she believed you were about to inherit Margaret's massive estate. I pulled one last document from my purse. It was a copy of a legal demand letter drawn up by Mr. Document, Harrison's firm holding Chloe civilly liable for the embezzled marital assets spent on her. I had M. Harrison send this notice to Chloe's apartment this morning. As I spoke, Mr. Harrison smoothly took over. We received a hysterical phone call from Chloe at my office just a short while ago. When I informed her that Marcus was being terminated with cause, receiving no inheritance and completely broke, she flipped on you with spectacular speed. Marcus's face twitched violently at the lawyer's calm words. She pinned all the blame on you, Marcus. She claimed you deceived her and used her. We made it clear we will pursue the funds spent on her, and she swore through her tears that she would never associate with you ever again. Liar. Chloe would never abandon me. Marcus frantically pulled his smartphone from his suit pocket with shaking hands. He desperately tapped the screen and held it to his ear, but the only thing that faintly echoed in the quiet room was the robotic voice he feared most. The number you are trying to reach has disconnected. He was completely blocked. Even when he opened his messaging app, it mercilessly displayed user not found. The mistress, realizing he was no longer a cash cow, flawlessly cut him off and ran. The new life he tried to grasp by throwing everything away was nothing more than a flimsy castle of sand. The smartphone slipped from Marcus's hand, hitting the floor with a dull thud. The absolute last drop of color drained from his face. The arrogant, hyper-confident man now looked like a deflated balloon, aging horribly in seconds. Company, money, relatives, inheritance, and mistress. Everything he arrogantly believed was his own power had crumbled completely in a matter of tens of minutes. Why? Why is this happening to me? Marcus muttered like a man delirious, collapsing to his knees and sinking onto the floor. I looked down at him and spoke coldly and clearly. Because you abandoned Margaret, who loved you, and because you sneered at my 20 years of dedication, calling it a chore. Marcus could not argue back with a single word. He covered his face with shaking hands, letting out small, muffled groans. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the room. The relatives, witnessing a destruction so total, could not move a muscle. Breaking the silence, Mr. Harrison slowly reached for the old envelope in the center of the table. Now that Marcus has paid the price for his sheer foolishness, I believe you will understand the true meaning of why Margaret left this envelope. At Mr. Harrison's words, Marcus's shoulders jerked and he slowly lifted his hollow eyes. I also stared quietly at the envelope. The final thing Margaret entrusted to me and the last words she desperately needed to convey to her sinning son, with everyone's eyes focused entirely on him. Mr. Harrison used a letter opener to quietly break the seal. What emerged was a piece of aged stationery and something completely unexpected. A tiny bundle of cloth. The moment I saw it, I gasped softly. As for Marcus, tears flooded from his eyes as if a dam had burst. The final curtain was about to fall on the truth. Mr. Harrison pulled the faded letter out. Then, from the bottom of the envelope, he retrieved the small object. It was a carefully folded piece of old baby blue fabric. It was incredibly small, slightly frayed at the edges. Looking closely, it was a tiny knitted baby mitten. The moment Marcus saw it, he choked on his breath. His bloodshot eyes were glued to the blue mitten. That is the mitten Margaret knitted for you when you were born. Mr. Harrison's quiet voice echoed in the room. Margaret kept this with her every single day until she died. Marcus's throat hitched. Marcus, earlier you claimed your mother accepted those bribes on her own, didn't you, Mr.? Harrison directed an icy glare at Marcus. You claimed your mother betrayed you and embezzled corporate funds. Marcus turned pale, his eyes darting. Yes, I did nothing wrong. Mom orchestrated the whole thing. Hearing Marcus still desperately clinging to such pathetic excuses, I felt a quiet fury. Just how far would this man desecrate his own mother to save himself? Mr. Harrison unfolded the letter and slowly began to read. Marcus, if you are reading this letter, it means you have lost everything. Margaret's dignified words came back to life through the attorney's voice. The day I learned you were committing fraud at your company, I tried to stop you. I cried and begged you over and over to turn yourself in and pay for your crimes. Marcus's shoulders jolted. The relatives held their breath, listening to the mother's final words, but you refused to listen to me. Instead, you screamed at me and forcefully took my passbook. I was trapped in a body that could not even walk to the police station. I was a pathetic mother who could not stop her son's crimes. Liar. That letter is a setup. Marcus shrieked, saliva flying from his mouth. Mom hated me. She wrote those lies to frame me. Aunt Susan threw a cold voice at him. You are still saying that? Every relative here knows exactly how much Margaret adored you. The eyes of the relatives were no longer looking at Marcus as a human being. It was a glare filled with pure contempt, as if looking at a hideous monster. Elena forged it. There is no proof anywhere. Marcus slammed his fist on the floor, desperately trying to justify himself, but I didn't flinch. Keeping my back perfectly straight, I locked eyes with him. We have proof. At my short response, Marcus froze entirely. Mr. Harrison gently turned the blue mitten over. Hidden inside the mitten was a tiny black object. It was an old micro-recorder, no bigger than a thumb. Margaret anticipated that you would lie and claimed she was senile. Mr. Harrison quietly pressed the play button. A sudden blast of static hissed through the room. Listen to me. Let me use your account. If you refuse, no dinner for you tomorrow. Suddenly, the violent younger voice of Marcus roared through the audio. The air in the room froze instantly. You are my parent. Are you trying to ruin my career? The recorder captured the violent sound of furniture being kicked. If you don't listen to me, I will throw you in the cheapest rotting nursing home I can find. Then Margaret's small, trembling, sobbing voice could be heard. Marcus, why are you doing these terrible things? Please stop. Shut up. Hand over the passbook and sign the checks. There was the sound of something shattering and the recording abruptly cut off. In the silence that returned to the room, no one could speak. Even Uncle Richard was trembling, pale as a sheet. Did Margaret set all this up? I asked quietly, looking down at Marcus, who was curled on the floor. Marcus could not form a single word of excuse anymore. He opened and closed his mouth, but no sound came out. Cold sweat poured from his entire body, leaving dark stains on the carpet. Margaret blamed herself for her paralyzed body. I clenched my hands tightly on my lap and slowly wove my words. Every time I got up to help her to the bathroom in the middle of the night, Margaret was clutching that blue mitten. And she was crying alone, suppressing her voice, crying over how the sweet little boy she loved so much had turned into this. My words weighed heavily on Marcus's back. Yet Margaret still could not turn you over to the police because she believed that someday you would realize your crimes and start over. Her love as a mother was exactly what kept her in perpetual agony. Large tears spilled from Marcus's eyes, but they were not tears of repentance toward his mother. They were tears of despair that all his lies were exposed and his escape routes completely severed. I just wanted to be recognized at the company, Marcus whispered in a frail, fading voice. That does not give you the right to threaten your own mother, Susan spat out coldly. And the relatives stood up all at once. We are leaving. I feel sick just breathing the same air as this man. Richard practically fled to the door, tearing it open. The other relatives followed, walking out without giving Marcus a second glance. Not a single person harbored any sympathy for him. The relatives who had once spoiled and elevated him abandoned him in the most brutal way possible. A few minutes later, only Mr. Harrison, myself, and Marcus, who was collapsed on the floor, remained in the large living room. The room was painfully silent. Marcus kept his hands on the floor, his shoulders shaking weakly. The company, the relatives, the mistress, the inheritance, everything he thought he had grasped with his own hands was an illusion. I stood up quietly. The floor felt pleasantly cool beneath my shoes. Marcus. At my cold voice, Marcus's shoulders jumped. He slowly raised his face, looking 10 years older. The bags under his eyes were deep, his lips cracked and dry. I pulled the green document from my purse, the divorce petition I had left on the table of that empty house yesterday, the paper he had laughed off as a pathetic threat. I placed it quietly on the floor right in front of him. Then I placed a black pen next to it. Margaret's final wish was for me to take my life back. I looked down into his eyes and spoke clearly. Your role is over. Never show your face in front of me again. Marcus reached out a trembling hand and stared at the divorce petition. He no longer had the option to refuse to sign it. In the quiet room, the dry sound of a pen scratching against paper began to echo emptily. The dry scratching of the pen echoed in the quiet room. The sound felt incredibly hollow, as if blowing away in the wind. Marcus's hand shook violently, the pen slipping multiple times. The letters he wrote were heavily distorted, a far cry from his formerly confident handwriting. I simply looked down at him in silence. For 20 years, I lived my life constantly gauging this man's moods, walking on eggshells, making sure not to anger him, always stepping back and clinging to him like a shadow. But the man in front of me now was no longer someone to fear. I didn't have a drop of anger or sorrow left. To me, this man, whose mind was entirely consumed by self-preservation, simply looked like a terribly small, pathetic creature. Eventually, Marcus signed the final line and dropped the pen without strength. It clattered against the floor. Mr. Harrison quietly reached out and pulled the green document toward himself. With a cold eye, he checked every line for errors. Everything is in order. Legally, the marriage between you two is completely dissolved. Mr. Harrison's words put a definitive period on a 20-year sentence. Marcus kept his head down and covered his face with both hands. Elena. A raspy, incredibly weak voice leaked through his fingers. I was wrong. Please forgive me. It was the very first time he had spoken words of apology. The old me might have heard those words and wavered, but the current me perfectly saw through the true reason behind them. You are not apologizing to me. At my cold voice, Marcus flinched. You are just terrified of losing everything and being all alone. You were fired. You lost the money. And your family abandoned you. That is why you are desperately trying to cling to the person you look down on the most. My words were like sharp blades, accurately piercing his vitals. Marcus could not raise his head, only letting out a small groan. Mr. Harrison began explaining the final legal procedures to him. It was a merciless declaration of reality. Marcus, tomorrow you will be formally terminated for cause. Naturally, you receive 0 severance and the company will pursue heavy civil litigation against you for the embezzled funds. Furthermore, you will be paying the legal fees and settlements involving Elena. Marcus's body began shaking uncontrollably. Regarding your mother's estate, while you could theoretically attempt to contest for a statutory minimum, any amount you received would instantly be seized to pay your corporate restitution and Elena's settlements. It wouldn't even cover it. You will be left with massive debt. There was not an ounce of sympathy in Mr. Harrison's voice. The $500,000 Marcus counted on would not save him. It was destined to vanish entirely to pay for the crimes he committed. What? What about the house? Marcus asked in a fading voice. The old childhood home where he had lived with his mother. To me it was a place of memories where I cleaned daily and cared for Margaret. There is still a mortgage balance of several tens of thousands of dollars on this house, Mr. Harrison answered flatly. Unemployed and drowning in debt. It will be impossible for you to keep paying the mortgage. Eventually, the bank will foreclose on it and put it up for auction. The childhood home you wanted to protect as the eldest son is gone. The moment he heard those words, Marcus seemed to forget how to breathe. The status of the eldest son he clung to was slipping right through his fingers. I quietly took a breath. I left my wedding ring on the dining table of that house. Marcus weakly raised his face to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mess of tears. It is platinum. You can pawn it for a few hundred. Use it to buy your next meal. I certainly do not need it anymore. There was not a single warm memory I needed to take from that house. You destroyed all of them over the last 20 years. That was my final parting gift and my most ruthless declaration of severance. The ring that swore eternal love was now nothing more than spare change for him to survive the day. Marcus left his mouth hanging open, staring blankly back at me. He was no longer allowed to argue or cling to me. He had absolutely no cards left to play. I stood up quietly. The coolness of the floor beneath my shoes made my heart feel even clearer. Mr. Harrison picked up his briefcase and stood up as well. I looked down one last time at Marcus groveling on the floor. The night Margaret died, I called you 30 times. Marcus's body jerked. If you had answered the phone even once, rushed to be by Margaret's side for her final moments, and shed genuine tears of apology, maybe I would have forgiven everything and stayed in that house. My words melted slowly into the quiet room. But you threw away that final chance yourself. I was truly exhausted over the last 20 years, but it is finally over. Goodbye. I bowed deeply and beautifully. It was not a greeting as a wife, but a ritual strictly for a complete stranger. Marcus couldn't say anything. He just rubbed his forehead against the carpet, letting out voiceless sobs. I turned my back and reached for the door. Bright afternoon sunlight was pouring into the hallway from outside. Without hesitation, I opened the door and stepped out into the blinding light. The pathetic cries of the man behind me were completely severed the moment the door clicked shut. 6 months passed quietly since that day. The seasons shifted from that chaotic summer into autumn, and the wind blowing past carried a pleasantly cool edge. I am currently standing in a cemetery on a small hill in a coastal town I had never known before. In front of me is a newly erected modest headstone. I crouched down and gently took my time polishing the stone with a soft cloth I brought along. Actually, when Marcus lost the house to debt and foreclosure, I made one request through Mr. Harrison. I asked to take custody of Margaret's urn. As Marcus and the relatives watched their lives collapse, nobody wanted to take responsibility for managing an expensive gravesite. Treating it like getting rid of a nuisance, they handed over her ashes without a fight. That is why I built a small grave in this new coastal town, a place where Margaret could sleep peacefully, undisturbed by anyone shouting. Margaret, it really feels like autumn now. The weather is beautiful today, too. I spoke to the headstone in a calm voice, just like when we used to drink tea in the living room. Of course, there was no reply from the stone, but when the autumn breeze gently swayed my hair, I felt as if Margaret was smiling and nodding, saying, "Yes, it is Elena. I am now starting an entirely new life in this quiet seaside town." The $500,000 inheritance Margaret left to save me, I never used a dime of it for luxury. I bought a small, older, but wonderfully sunlit condo near the ocean. From the balcony, I can see the blue water glittering brilliantly, and I started working part-time at a boutique tea and coffee shop on the edge of town. It is a cozy little store run by a sweet older couple specializing in roasted teas and organic blends. Every day surrounded by the deep aroma of roasted tea leaves, I exchange warm words with the local customers. The quiet moments slowly pouring amber tea from a pot into a cup have steadily and surely healed my wounded heart. Waking up in the morning to make a careful breakfast just for myself, reading a favorite book in a quiet room at night while drinking warm tea. These incredibly mundane everyday moments feel more radiant to me than anything else. I no longer have to live in fear, constantly reading the room. I don't have to flinch at my husband's irritated footsteps in the dead of night or shrink my shoulders at unreasonable shouting. I have finally taken back my own quiet, peaceful life. A few days ago, a thick letter arrived from Attorney Harrison. Inside was a brief update on the fate of Marcus and the relatives after that disastrous family meeting. As predicted, Marcus was officially terminated with cause the following day. Sued heavily for restitution by the company and burdened with the settlements toward me, he was left with nothing but insurmountable debt. The house he clung to as the eldest son was seized by the bank as he couldn't pay the mortgage, and it was officially foreclosed on last month. Uncle Richard, who had accused me of being a thief, had his past fraud thoroughly investigated by corporate auditors, and his company was driven into bankruptcy. The relatives are apparently entirely estranged now, blaming each other for the fallout. Not a single relative reached out a helping hand to Marcus after he lost everything. Chloe, the mistress, abandoned him the very second she received Mr. Harrison's legal notice. I hear Marcus is now living in some distant, unfamiliar town, doing backbreaking manual labor to slowly pay off an endless mountain of debt. For a man with such high pride who always looked down on others and believed he was special, working covered in mud every day while being ignored by everyone, must be the most agonizing, hellish punishment imaginable. When I read that letter, no emotion welled up in my heart. I had no desire to laugh at him and say he got what he deserved. Yet, I didn't feel a shred of pity for him either. I simply took a deep breath of relief, thinking, their story is truly over now. In my heart, Marcus had completely turned into a colorless memory of the past. There is not a drop of anger or resentment left in me. I washed my cloth at the cemetery water spigot and pulled a small light blue fabric from my purse, the knitted baby mitten Margaret made for Marcus. Mr. Harrison disposed of the micro-recorder hidden inside it. I kept the tiny mitten as a symbol of Margaret's deep tragic love. I gently wrapped the mitten in both hands and softly closed my eyes. Margaret, that man is paying for his sins alone now. I spoke slowly in my heart. Exactly what you feared most has come to pass. But this was the right choice, wasn't it? The profound agony of a mother who endured the pain of giving birth, raised a son she loved, yet could not forgive the crimes he committed. How agonizing and heart-wrenching that decision must have been. I understand it painfully well now. Margaret was a mother to the very end. By ending her son's life as he knew it, she prevented him from committing any more crimes. Whenever I look at this blue mitten, I remember Margaret's strictness and the boundless kindness that lay beneath it. Even without a blood connection, we were truly mother and daughter. The 20 years I spent in that dark, cold house were absolutely not a waste of time. Because the time I endured ultimately left me with the irreplaceable family bond of Margaret. When I opened my eyes, a refreshing breeze from the ocean swept past my feet. I placed Margaret's favorite purple gentian flowers on the sparkling clean grave. I lit a small memorial candle and quietly pressed my hands together one last time. When I stood up, my body felt surprisingly light, as if I had sprouted wings. Looking up, a boundlessly high, clear autumn sky stretched endlessly. From the distance, the calm sound of the waves could be heard. It was vastly different from the waves Marcus listened to at that tropical resort. It was a gentle, serene sound that seemed to wash the soul clean. Well, I need to get to the shop. I smiled softly at the headstone and turned on my heel. Walking down the sloping path of the cemetery, my steps were strong and looking straight ahead. Today, I plan to roast a new batch of autumn tea leaves at the shop. The warm aroma of tea and people greeting me with smiles are waiting for me. A fresh start at 50. Society might say it is late, but to me, I feel younger and newer than I ever have. I am no longer a convenient tool for someone else, nor am I anyone's property. I am living my own life. I felt Margaret's gentle gaze warmly watching over my back as I started walking. I will never look back at the past again. I will continue walking proudly with a smile down this new morning path bathed in